When we think about ancient history, we almost always picture powerful kings wearing heavy gold crowns, sitting on massive thrones, and ruling over poor, helpless peasants. Because modern society is built on strict hierarchies, we naturally assume that dividing humans into rulers and followers is just hardwired into our biological DNA. But archaeological evidence reveals a totally mind-blowing truth. For over 95% of human history, absolute equality was the strict, unquestionable rule of law. If a prehistoric hunter-gatherer suddenly stood up, proudly called himself a king, and started aggressively barking orders at his tribe, he wouldn't be respected. He would be completely laughed at, exiled into the wilderness, or even assassinated in his sleep by his own people. So, if ancient humans spent hundreds of thousands of years violently rejecting authority and living as absolute equals, how exactly did one ordinary guy manage to convince, or force, the entire rest of society to bow down? For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small, tight-knit nomadic bands of about 30 to 50 people. In these Paleolithic societies, survival was a brutal, everyday struggle that required absolute, unconditional cooperation. Because they were constantly moving to follow animal herds, it was physically impossible to accumulate personal wealth. You could only own what you could comfortably carry on your back. Furthermore, long before the invention of salt preservation or refrigeration, a massive pile of hunted meat would completely rot in just a few days. Therefore, hoarding resources was not just socially frowned upon, it was biologically pointless. If you managed to take down a massive mammoth, the only logical bank to store that surplus food was directly in the stomachs of your friends and family. By sharing everything you caught, you effectively ensured that when you inevitably failed your next hunt, someone else would feed you. In this primitive environment, wealth simply did not exist, and without the accumulation of wealth, there was absolutely no foundation for power. But what about physical strength, or natural charisma? Couldn't a highly skilled hunter just use his massive muscles or persuasive charm to bully the rest of the tribe into serving him? Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer tribes have observed a fascinating psychological defense mechanism that they call a reverse dominance hierarchy. In the animal kingdom, the biggest, most aggressive silverback gorilla beats his chest and physically dominates the weaker apes to become the undisputed leader. But ancient humans used their advanced intelligence to flip that dynamic completely upside down. Instead of the strongest individual dominating the group, the collective group actively teamed up to absolutely dominate anyone who tried to step out of line. The tribe inherently recognized that individual arrogance and unchecked ego were dangerous threats to their fragile social harmony. If a highly successful hunter started acting even slightly arrogant, boasting about his incredible skills, or demanding special treatment, the tribe did not bow down. They aggressively deployed psychological warfare. They used a cultural practice that scientists call leveling mechanisms. First, they would ruthlessly mock him, making sarcastic jokes about his fragile ego and relentlessly insulting his achievements to shrink his pride. For example, if he brought back a giant fat antelope, the elders would look at it and loudly complain that it was just a disgusting bag of skin and bones, totally worthless. If the arrogant hunter ignored the mocking and still tried to forcefully act like a boss, the punishment severely escalated. The tribe would completely socially isolate him, refusing to speak to him or share his fire. If he became violently aggressive or refused to step down, the tribe would collectively wait until he was asleep, and the rest of the men would simply assassinate him to protect their democratic peace. For over 300,000 years, human society was a fiercely guarded egalitarian utopia, where the absolute worst crime you could ever commit was thinking you were better than someone else. The absolute destruction of this fiercely protected egalitarian utopia began roughly 12,000 years ago with the most transformative event in human history, the Neolithic agricultural revolution. When our ancestors finally stopped endlessly chasing wild animal herds and decided to settle down to plant seeds, they unknowingly walked directly into a devastating social trap. The transition from hunting to farming introduced a completely new, highly disruptive element into human society: non-perishable food. Unlike a dead mammoth that rots in a few days, Agricultural crops like wheat, barley, and rice could be completely dried out, tightly sealed in massive clay pots, and safely stored in giant stone silos for years without ever spoiling. For the very first time in human evolution, an individual person could actually accumulate long-term wealth. A grain silo was effectively the world's first savings account, but farming was also incredibly unpredictable and deeply tied to the unpredictable whims of nature. Some farmers naturally had better, more fertile plots of land located closer to the river. Others might have had more physical stamina to work longer hours, or perhaps they were just insanely lucky with localized rainfall. Slowly but surely, over several generations, a tiny handful of families began consistently producing slightly more food than they could eat, while other less fortunate families struggled just to survive. This biological surplus fundamentally broke the ancient rules of absolute equality. The critical turning point happened when a severe, unexpected crisis struck, like a brutal winter or a devastating multi-year drought. In the old hunter-gatherer days, if there was no food, everyone simply starved together as equals. But now, when the desperate, starving villagers looked around, they saw that one single family still had a massive, overflowing grain silo. The starving masses could no longer use their ancient leveling mechanisms to mock or isolate this wealthy farmer. You absolutely cannot make fun of the one man who holds the only food that will keep your children from starving to death. Instead, you have to approach him, beg for his help, and offer him something incredibly valuable in exchange for his grain, your absolute loyalty, and your physical labor. The man who controlled the grain silo suddenly controlled the people. Without realizing it, humanity had just invented the very first, unbreakable chains of social inequality. Before formal kings ever sat on golden thrones or commanded massive, heavily armed military forces, early human societies experienced the subtle, manipulative rise of a fascinating political figure that anthropologists refer to as the big man. These early power brokers did not conquer their neighbors using bloody violence or terrifying coercion. Instead, they weaponized something far more insidious and psychologically binding: extreme generosity. Once a cunning farmer managed to accumulate a massive surplus of grain or a large herd of domestic animals, he realized that simply hoarding his wealth would eventually make him a target for jealousy and theft. To secure his position, he had to transform his physical agricultural wealth into intangible political power. The big man achieved this by throwing massive, incredibly lavish communal feasts. He would publicly slaughter his best livestock, open his overflowing grain silos, and invite the entire village, and sometimes even neighboring tribes, to eat and drink until they were completely stuffed. On the surface, this looked like an act of pure, selfless charity. The villagers celebrated him, singing songs about his incredible kindness and unmatched generosity. But beneath this friendly celebration, a dark and invisible psychological trap was snapping shut. In ancient human psychology, accepting a massive gift without giving something of equal value in return created an unbearable sense of social obligation. By feeding the entire village, the big man essentially trapped everyone in a suffocating web of invisible social debt. Since the poor villagers could never possibly afford to repay him with an equal amount of food, they had to repay him with the only thing they had left: their obedience. When the big man needed a new house built, the villagers felt obligated to build it for free. When a dispute broke out in the community, everyone naturally looked to the big man to make the final judgment, elevating him to the role of an informal judge. He didn't need to hire a violent police force to force people to listen to him. He had successfully bought their absolute loyalty using roasted meat and fermented beer. This ingenious manipulation of human gratitude was the crucial stepping stone between egalitarian tribes and tyrannical monarchies. Power was no longer seized, it was carefully purchased, one feast at a time. The delicate system established by the psychological manipulation of the big man functioned remarkably well during periods of stability and resource abundance. However, as agricultural populations continued their relentless explosion, available arable land near critical water sources became increasingly scarce, and competition between neighboring villages intensified to a breaking point. This inevitable friction, perhaps exacerbated by a sudden natural disaster like a devastating drought, precipitated a critical historical tipping point, the terrifying outbreak of chronic, organized human warfare. When a starving rival village attacked, looking to steal the stored grain surplus that represented survival, a big man, with his network of subtle social favors, was suddenly completely useless. Soft power is fantastic for coordinating the harvest or building a new communal hall, but it is utterly ineffective against a sudden rain of lethal arrows. In the horrifying face of an existential threat that threatened everyone with annihilation, the rules of human society drastically and suddenly shifted. To survive, the tribe desperately needed immediate, decisive, and centralized command, not time-consuming consensus or polite, lengthy negotiations over dinner. They needed a ferocious alpha protector. The tribe therefore willingly turned to the strongest, most brutal, and most highly skilled warrior among them, the man who excelled specifically at organized violence. For the sake of sheer survival, the desperate villagers willingly suspended their ancient egalitarian traditions and voluntarily handed over absolute, dictatorial command to this military leader, the warlord. It was meant to be a temporary emergency measure. Lead us until the immediate threat is eliminated, then you must return to being just another equal among us. But this was the ultimate psychological and political trap. Once the crisis was resolved and the enemy defeated, the warlord looked at the absolute power he possessed and simply refused to relinquish it. Unlike the big man, who was constantly forced to win popularity contests through continuous acts of competitive generosity, the warlord now maintained tight control through the terrifying reality of hard power, the immediate, credible threat of physical violence. The warlord institutionalized his coercive position by establishing the world's very first army, a small, dedicated group of professional warriors who were loyal exclusively to him, paid not with social favors, but with physical war booty, prioritized access to the grain surplus, or grants of control over land. If a villager dared to mock this new leader, attempt to implement ancient leveling mechanisms, or demand the return of their collective freedom, they were no longer met with sarcastic jokes. They were met with the sharp edge of a copper axe. Soft power based on social obligation had been violently replaced by coercive power based on sheer, unrelenting brute force. The foundation of true, coercive hierarchy was set. While ruling through absolute brute force and a loyal, heavily armed military guard is highly effective in the short term, it is incredibly expensive, constantly stressful, and notoriously unstable in the long run. A warlord who relies solely on fear can never truly lower his guard. He must constantly look over his shoulder, forever terrified of being assassinated in his sleep by a disgruntled peasant or a jealous rival commander. The fundamental problem with ruling by the sword is that the oppressed masses will inevitably outnumber the swordsman. So to transition from a temporary military dictator into a permanent generational king, the warlord desperately needed a new, infinitely more powerful mechanism of control. He needed a psychological weapon that would make the peasants police themselves. He found the ultimate solution by forging a dark, incredibly powerful political alliance with the spiritual leaders of the tribe, the shamans and the priests. This strategic alliance birthed the most successful and longest-running political scam in human history, the concept of divine right. The priests stood before the exhausted, terrified masses and delivered a brilliantly manipulative message. They proclaimed that the warlord did not seize power through bloody violence or selfish ambition. Instead, he was specifically chosen, blessed, and elevated by the immortal gods themselves. In ancient societies like Egypt and Mesopotamia, they took this propaganda even further, claiming the king was actually a living, breathing god on earth, descended directly from the heavens to maintain cosmic order. This theological lie completely rewired the psychology of the population. It fundamentally transformed the nature of obedience. If you rebelled against a normal man with a sword, you were simply a brave political revolutionary fighting for your freedom. But if you dared to rebel against a divinely appointed king, you were committing the ultimate cosmic sin. The priests convinced the peasants that any disobedience would anger the gods, resulting in devastating curses, multi-year droughts, horrific plagues, and eternal suffering in the afterlife. Suddenly, the peasants were no longer just afraid of the king's army, they were absolutely terrified of the universe itself. This brilliant psychological manipulation meant the king no longer needed to constantly threaten his people with physical violence. The people willingly bowed down out of deep religious terror. The bloody warlord had successfully wrapped his iron fist in a sacred divine glove, permanently cementing the institution of monarchy into the human psyche. The invention of kings was not a natural biological evolution or some inevitable cosmic destiny. It was a slow, calculated social hijacking that took thousands of years to complete. It started with a simple surplus of grain, evolved through the clever manipulation of social debt by the big men, escalated into the brutal violence of desperate warlords, and was finally cemented by the ultimate psychological lie of divine right. Humanity essentially traded its ancient, fiercely protected equality for the illusion of security and order. So the next time you see a powerful billionaire manipulating the system, or a politician acting like an untouchable ruler, just remember, they are merely playing a very old game designed by the world's first grain hoarders. If this deep dive into our dark political past blew your mind, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Keep wondering, keep learning, and stay simply ancient.